The moment that hug didn't land, everything broke. Not loudly, not publicly, but in that quiet, almost invisible shift, the kind that only insiders noticed, the entire dynamic between King Charles and Harry allegedly collapsed in a way that no statement, no press briefing, no carefully worded royal response could ever repair. Because this wasn't just a missed embrace, this was something colder, something calculated, something final. Harry stepped forward expecting warmth, expecting history to soften the moment, expecting that a father, especially one facing time, might lean into instinct instead of protocol. But what actually happened? That's where the story starts twisting. Because according to what's now quietly circulating behind palace walls, King Charles didn't just hesitate. King Charles stepped back. Not dramatically, not aggressively, but just enough to turn what should have been a healing moment into something painfully awkward and deeply revealing. And here's where it gets unsettling. Because that single movement, the refusal to fully accept the embrace, wasn't random. It aligned too perfectly with everything that followed. The distance, the formality, the silence, the way the entire meeting unfolded like a controlled operation instead of a family reunion. Inside that room, there was no emotional reset, no private forgiveness, no whispered understanding. Instead, there was structure, there was positioning, there was a clear, almost clinical separation between personal and institutional boundaries. And Harry felt it instantly. You could sense it in the way the conversation never went where it was supposed to go. Every attempt to pivot towards something real, something unresolved, something human was gently but firmly redirected. Safe topics, controlled responses, surface-level engagement. It wasn't just avoidance, it was containment. And that's when the second layer of this story begins to unfold. Because sources close to the situation aren't just talking about that awkward hug anymore, they're talking about what happened after. The quiet decision, the invisible line that was drawn, the alleged internal move that changed everything going forward. King Charles didn't raise his voice. King Charles didn't make a public declaration. King Charles did something far more powerful. King Charles allegedly froze all informal communication. Think about that for a second. No spontaneous calls, no private messages, no back-channel conversations, no emotional access outside of strictly controlled official settings, just silence, wrapped in protocol. And suddenly, that awkward hug doesn't look awkward anymore. It looks intentional. Because if communication was already being restricted, if boundaries were already being reinforced behind the scenes, then that moment of physical distance wasn't a reaction, it was a signal. A quiet, undeniable confirmation that the relationship had shifted into something else entirely. Something colder, something strategic. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Because Harry didn't walk into that meeting empty-handed. There were expectations, there were pressures, there were stakes that went far beyond family tension. The need for validation, the need for proximity, the need for something, anything that could prove the connection still existed in a meaningful way. But inside that room, every path closed. There was no photograph, no symbolic gesture, no moment that could be captured, repackaged, and presented as reconciliation. Even the smallest opportunities, those subtle, seemingly harmless requests, were quietly denied or redirected. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, just not allowed. And that's what makes this so unsettling, because nothing exploded, nothing collapsed in front of cameras. Instead, everything was controlled, managed, reduced until there was nothing left to take. And that's when people started noticing the pattern. The presence of Queen Camilla, the positioning within the room, the physical barriers, tables, space, distance, all reinforcing the same unspoken message. This wasn't a meeting designed to reconnect, this was a meeting designed to regulate, to limit, to contain. And Harry was no longer being engaged as a son trying to rebuild trust. Harry was being managed as a variable that needed to be controlled. Even the smallest details started to feel loaded. The timing, the duration, the way conversations were allowed to breathe but never deepen, the way every emotional opening quietly closed before it could fully form. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the reality started to settle in. This wasn't about one awkward hug, this was about access. And that access, according to what's now being whispered across royal circles, may have just been shut down in a way that's far more permanent than anyone expected. Because freezing informal communication doesn't just create distance, it creates a system, a structure where every interaction is filtered, recorded, and controlled, where spontaneity disappears, where emotion becomes irrelevant, where connection becomes conditional. And once that system is in place, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. So the question isn't whether that hug was awkward. The real question is, was that the moment King Charles made the decision final, or was that decision already made and the hug was just the first visible crack? Because if this truly is the beginning of a communication freeze, then what happens next doesn't unfold in private anymore. And just when it seemed like the silence inside that room had already said everything it needed to say. The real shift began not in words, not in gestures, but in what didn't happen after. Because as Harry stepped out of that carefully controlled environment, there was no follow-up, no quiet reassurance, no private signal that the door was still open somewhere behind the scenes. Instead, what followed was something far more unsettling, a vacuum. The kind of vacuum that doesn't just happen accidentally inside a system that precise. The kind that suggests intention, planning, and a decision that had already been quietly finalized long before that awkward moment ever took place. Because here's what started to surface almost immediately among those who watched these movements closely. Communication didn't just slow down, it stopped evolving. There were no subtle leaks hinting at progress, no insider whispers about another meeting being arranged, no signals of reconciliation quietly being prepared. And in royal dynamics, that absence isn't neutral, it's strategic. It means something has been locked into place, something that isn't meant to shift easily, something designed to hold firm no matter how much external pressure builds. And suddenly, that awkward hug starts to feel less like a personal misfire and more like the visible edge of a much larger decision. Because if informal communication has truly been frozen, then what remains isn't a relationship, it's a protocol. Every interaction becomes deliberate, filtered, stripped of spontaneity, stripped of emotion, stripped of anything that could be interpreted, reshaped, or used outside those walls. And for someone like Harry, who has relied on the ability to navigate between personal and public narratives, that shift changes everything. Because without informal access, there is no space to rebuild quietly. There is no late night conversation, no unguarded moment, no chance to repair what's broken away from scrutiny. Everything becomes formal, scheduled, observed, and once a relationship is forced into that structure, it stops behaving like a relationship at all. It becomes something colder, something transactional, something that operates on rules instead of trust. And the deeper this situation is examined, the clearer it becomes that this wasn't a sudden reaction to a single moment. The environment itself had already been set. The positioning, the presence, the timing, even the way topics were controlled, it all points to a system that was already in place before Harry ever stepped into that room. A system designed not to reconnect, but to limit, not to reopen doors, but to ensure they couldn't be pushed open again without consequence. Even the departure tells its own story. No cameras waiting, no carefully staged image, no symbolic gesture to suggest that something meaningful had been repaired. Just a quiet exit, almost deliberately uneventful, as if the absence of spectacle was the final statement. Because in a world where every image carries weight, choosing not to create one becomes its own kind of message. A message that says nothing has changed. A message that says nothing will. And that's where the tension doesn't end, it shifts. Because once communication is frozen, the conflict doesn't disappear. It moves, it transforms, it finds new ways to surface, often in places no one expects, often through actions rather than words. And in this case, the implications stretch far beyond a single meeting, far beyond a single moment that felt awkward on the surface. Because what happens when access is gone? What happens when the only path forward is through official channels that offer no flexibility, no warmth, no room for negotiation? The answer isn't immediate, but it builds quietly, gradually, until the pressure reaches a point where something has to give. And that's the part no one is saying out loud yet. Because if this freeze holds, if informal communication truly remains shut down, then the next move doesn't belong to King Charles anymore. It doesn't even belong to the institution. It belongs to the reaction that follows. And reactions, especially in situations like this, are rarely controlled in the same way. So the story that began with an awkward hug doesn't end with distance, it evolves into something far more unpredictable. Because once silence takes over, every absence becomes a clue, every delay becomes a signal, and every move that doesn't happen starts to matter just as much as the ones that do.